Hello again, everybody, and a particular hello to Melanie Corbishley, who's just asked the first question of the day, which is, have we started yet? The answer is no, but we are about to. Hopefully you can all hear me now. Mel, just for your info, I did come on at 2 o'clock and say we were just waiting for a few more people to join. Quite a lot more have joined in that meantime, so hello to everybody who's arrived in that time. As you can see from the screen, this is a panel discussion, relatively freeform, we hope, with the pretty broad title of Regeneration. We've got my two colleagues, James Findlay QC and Clare Parry, here, both of whom know an awful lot about regeneration and are ready to answer all of your difficult and technical questions. But we're also delighted to have with us Jeremy Potter, who's the Spatial Planning Manager at Chelmsford City Council. Chelmsford, of course, is one of England's newest cities and has, in the last 10 or so years, seen quite a significant amount of regeneration in the city centre, much of it marshalled and directed by Jeremy. So we hope that he'll have lots of interesting stuff to say. Just a few sort of nuts and bolts before we get going. You probably will want to, I'll stop the screen sharing in a minute, take that picture of us all off. And you probably want to watch this in gallery mode on Zoom if you can, so that you can see all of the speakers, but I leave that entirely up to you. I suspect that's best. What we really want is questions, not necessarily about whether we've started or not, although that's a good start, but we definitely want questions as we go along, contributions, and indeed, if any of you have burning things that you want to say, contribute to the debate, then stick it on the Q&A, and I think there's a mechanism that I can even put you on unmute and then you can contribute. So we're very much hoping that you'll all join in and make contributions, but the key thing is to ask questions. We do have some which we'll get started with, but please feel free to stick them on the Q&A as we go along. I'm going to stop screen sharing now. Hopefully you can now see everybody on the screen, with the exception of Jeremy, who needs to turn his camera on. He's probably still blushing from the introduction I gave him. But that's a good reminder. Jeremy, I think we'll start with you now that you're on screen. Do you want to, you heard what I said about Chelmsford, it's probably more than the last 10 years. You've been there for much of the time in which Chelmsford's kind of grown and in fact become a city. Do you want to just say a few things about your experience of regenerating the city centre?
Yes, no, thank you very much, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. I mean, as Joe says, we've been on a bit of a journey in Chelmsford, probably over the last 20 years or so. We've kind of changed from a relatively, well, I'd say maybe sleepy town into something that's a little different now in terms of the amount of new development that's happening there and the amount of regeneration schemes that are coming forward in Chelmsford. So, I mean, I've been kind of responsible for the local plan, and also I'm responsible for sort of affordable housing at Chelmsford City Council. And for those that we all know, obviously we all know about Chelmsford, but centre of the world. But for those that don't know, I mean, we're sort of slap bang in the middle of Essex. We're a reasonable size. We are the only city in Essex. We got awarded that in 2012. We're about 180,000 people, so we're quite a significant place actually, and sort of part of a number of towns around London of that type of scale. I think we've always been pretty proud of our kind of plan-led approach at Chelmsford. So we've always endeavoured to have a local plan, an up-to-date local plan, and that has kind of gone from sort of the mid-90s all the way through to today. And as part of that, I think we would say that that has been a big part of the catalyst of change in Chelmsford, actually providing some certainty, providing a framework, providing the ability for investment to come into Chelmsford. And I think we've sort of, that's been realised through the previous local development framework system. So we had a whole sort of suite of different statutory development plans in place. And one of those was our then town centre area action plan, our TCAAP. And we sort of identified a series of large regeneration schemes that we wanted to bring forward in that plan period up to 2021, in fact. So a lot of those are now actually been built out or in the process of just finalising those. And so there's some examples. So we had a former university campus site in the middle of the town as it was then, and then that moved to an edge of centre new campus, and then we had the opportunity for a new development there, which is called City Park West, which is being undertaken by Genesis. Quite a lot of PRS in there and affordable, as well as, so it's a residentially led scheme, but there's some significant non-res uses in there, office, community uses, food and beverage uses, and community uses. So a real sort of a mixed regeneration scheme. And I think actually all of our schemes, those schemes that came through the previous local development framework, were residential led. So I think possibly in other areas it may well be that the residential is more of a mix, whereas in Chelmsford they've all been residential led schemes, with the exception of one that I'll just speak about in a minute. So City Park West was one. We've got we're the former kind of the home of radio, in fact. The first radio broadcast in the world was in Chelmsford. But Marconi had their factories in Chelmsford. We have a factory that came to the end of its life sort of 10, 15 years ago, and that now has been developed. That's another large residential-led development, about 400, 500 new homes there, and a mixture of uses, a new cosmetic company that have got their HQ there. So some other mixed uses there. And then also we own some land as well. So Chelmer Waterside is an area in the middle of the city centre, next to the rivers and canals by its very name, and the City Council was actually, through its land holding as well, is seeking to regenerate that area. So the Chelmer Waterside project, first part of that is coming out of the ground as we speak, about 450 new homes. Second part of that is with a new local plan. And then I think finally, in terms of the regeneration schemes that have happened, we've had a large retail new development right in the city centre. So we're quite proud to be able to sort of ensure that our comparison retail offer has all been done right in the middle of the city centre, and there wasn't sort of out town retail parks. So that's a large scheme called Bond Street, which is about, I think it's about 44, 45 shops units in there, and anchored by a new John Lewis of about 120,000 square feet, John Lewis, which has been open a couple of years now. So I think the past plan has all been about ensuring the regeneration of some of these really large sites, but residentially led, apart from the latter, in terms of actually this kind of renaissance of the city. And I think what we've tried to do, and Joe sort of inferred there, is that ensuring that continues, we've been really wanted to make sure that our local development framework, which covered the period to 2021, is replaced seamlessly by a new local plan, a new MPPF compliant local plan, and that has been the process over the last couple of years, and we've just adopted that in May of this year to give us a planned horizon to 2036. And that continues that kind of focus on regeneration sites within the city centre, Chelmsford Waterside Part 2. And I'm sure quite a lot of these conversations might come up because quite a lot of things have changed over the last year. So, it may well be that some of those, we need to have a look at some of those strategies going forwards. But I think just in terms of bringing that local plan forwards, it's not an easy job, and I know all of those people that have been involved in bringing a local plan forwards in the new regime. There's a lot of work required and a lot of evidence required to bring that forward. I know a lot of other councils have struggled with that. So I suppose from a local authority perspective, it's just ensuring that the resources are there to ensure that we have the evidence to support some of the proposals that we're being being put forward. I think I'll stop there at the moment, Joe, if that's okay, and hopefully that's given you just a little bit of an insight. Thank you.
It has, although I'm not going to let you off that easily, because as you've been speaking, a question has come in. I mean, that was obviously a pretty positive story, and I'm not saying that there isn't a place for positivity, but just to redress the balance, Jay Millwood has said, a practical question, what are the things or things you can choose that you now wish you'd or Chelmsford had done differently? For example, what has been less successful of that project?
I think in some respects, I don't think this sounds conceited, actually, doesn't it? I don't think there's anything major that would be done differently. I think actually the main thing that's come forward in the last year is the fact that we were always looking for active travel, cycling and walking to be at the heart of what we do. Because for those that know Chelmsford, we're quite small. It's quite a compact centre, and it absolutely is brilliant for cycling and walking. And I think if we'd had the opportunity to do a little bit more, we would have probably focused on that right at the beginning and everything building up from that. Whereas that has become more important going forwards, obviously, because of the situation we're all facing at the moment. I think the other thing that I probably would have done, and I know this is probably a bit of an aside, is the fact that we have a garden community. So not only are we regenerating our city centre and our urban areas, we have a brand new community being planned to the northeast of Chelmsford. And I think in terms of how we may have put that forward through the local plan process, I think actually it sort of came a little bit late in the day in terms of the local plan, and I think probably to have that a little bit more up and front and centre in the local plan would have been a lot better. But in general terms, we've met our need in terms of retail. We're happy with the quality of the type of retail that has happened in the city centre. I think the residential elements within the city centre have really improved the environment and brought people back into the city, actually living there. So I think actually those sorts of things, and have that residential led process, I think I really welcome.
Thanks, and thanks for the question. It leads on actually to another of the questions we've had in advance, which is, things happen. COVID-19 happened. We all thought we knew how the world worked, and then along came the pandemic and everything looks different. So this question is, what effect will COVID-19 or the pandemic have on city regeneration schemes a bit like Chelmsford's one? For example, do people still want to live in high density, densified town centres? Claire, do you want to deal with that? What's COVID-19 doing to regeneration?
Yes, well, I mean, that's obviously one of the primary questions, because certainly, so we're told by the estate agents, the trend at the moment is that people don't want to live in city centres, particularly in central London, and they're looking to move out more into the countryside and market towns outside of the centre of cities. I suppose the big question for regeneration is whether that's going to be a short-term reaction to the current events, or whether that turns into a long-term trend. And I suppose in part of whether that turns into a long-term trend is whether there's still going to be things to attract people to live in the city centre, whether we are regenerating these city centres to be vibrant, exciting places to live, so that when the people who are currently at university or sitting in their parents' homes doing university online, start to get their first jobs, whether they're going to be attracted to move into the city centres in the way that previous generations have, or whether they're going to have something different. But of course, the other very substantial point we need to think about is retail, and I think that obviously relates to the question I've just seen popped up on the question and answer, because COVID-19 is obviously accelerating a lot of trends that we were seeing in retail anyway, in terms of less use of stores with footfall, a lot of very recognisable chains having problems, and I'm sure the next lockdown, the month before what would classically be a big Christmas shopping season, will accelerate the trends of difficulties for retail. So what will retail look like in city centres in a few years' time? I suspect it's not going to look like the way it's looked previously and the way we've traditionally used retail to regenerate city centres.
Thanks, Claire. James, do you want to add to that?
Sorry, I was just looking at the next questions that were coming up. No, I agree with that, and I have a feeling that that it's very likely that it won't just be purely retail-led regeneration in future. And Jeremy and I were discussing earlier, there could be, contrary to what Claire was saying, there's still probably scope for housing-led regeneration, bringing housing back into the middle of the city centre, particularly allied with Jeremy's idea that people can walk and cycle, so that I don't think we should forget that COVID hopefully is going to be, in overall scheme of things, a short-term phenomenon, whereas the drive for a cleaner environment and all things environmental is going to be a much longer-term underlying phenomenon, and that is going to require us to continue, I think, to live in, well, most people live in big cities, and to continue the need for their regeneration.
Before we leave this topic, Amina Rafiq asks Jeremy, but any of you can answer. She says, as the world we know is changing, would you say there's a shift away from retail to live-work units?
Yes, absolutely. And I think just picking up on the points that were just made, I think actually what we're seeing actually sort of mirrors what Claire was saying in terms of there is demand. There's quite a lot of demand at the moment, we're being told, from some of our greenfield sites for housing on greenfield sites. There seems to be, we're being told that they can't build them quick enough at the moment, which seems quite, a bit counterintuitive. But and I think that is down to the realization that you don't necessarily need to live exactly where you work or as close to where you worked before, providing you've got a really good broadband connection. We're all doing this now, aren't we? So and I think that will continue, although I do take the point that actually within the city centre, I think a city centre is always going to be, or a town centre is always going to be an activity, as a hub of activity. Now that activity might change, and I think going on that Amina's point in terms of that shift away, I think that may well be, there may well be a shift away, but it's footfall, isn't it? It's whatever that footfall is, it's actually attracting people into the city centre or into the town centres for particular uses, maybe more services, more leisure in the future, obviously, and food and beverage in the future, rather than that kind of more traditional large footplate retail offers that have been possible in the past. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, live work, and I think that kind of comes on to that whole health and well-being part as well, and the fact that people have learned over the last couple of months that actually having a bit of outdoor space is quite nice, even if it is a relatively small balcony. But having some outdoor space is nice, and having choice and access to quality outdoor space, that is really exceptionally important. And also having new homes that actually are fulfil their purpose in terms of their size, and able to get, actually able to have some space for some working space, as well as your normal kind of living space and cooking space and lounging space and whatever else you do in your home. So yeah, no, I think that's going to be really important. I mean, I thought also, as I'm talking, I've just seen that Anthony's question about the use class changes, and I do think that that's really important part of how town and city centres are going to change going forwards, and the ability to be much more flexible. And I think I was saying earlier that actually some of the schemes in our city centre have been quite flexible about the mixed use, so it isn't prescribing, even before the changes of use, we weren't necessarily prescribing the exact use classes. There was a sort of a range of use classes that would be acceptable town centre uses. So I think the jury's out in some respects on how this is going to affect. If the need for retail, if retail demand picks up again, then yes, actually, the point that Anthony makes could well be an issue. where retail is kind of, you know, out of offices are switching to retail in not particularly sustainable locations. But I think actually what's happened is this is a continuation of the trend that was happening pre-COVID in any case, with the demise of large retail.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that does bring us quite nicely onto Anthony's question, which is a question that I know a few people have wanted to explore. Anthony says, do the panel have any views on the recent use class changes? There's possible concern that new Class E could, for example, enable out-of-centre offices to switch to retail without the need for sequential impact testing. Could this undermine town centre regeneration? Are there mechanisms to protect town centres in light of the amended use classes? Of course, all of that, the shift to everything being, well, not everything, but a lot of previous town centre use classes being lumped together in Class E, is talking about retail-led becomes less clear what we mean, because retail obviously can now be changed to restaurants and so on without any control by the local planning authority. So James, do you want to deal with Anthony's question first of all?
Well, I'll kick off with it. There are a number of points to be made about the changes to the use classes order. First of all, it's just applying to changes of use, not operational development. And quite often you need to have both together to implement whatever change of use is taking place. The second point is that there's clearly going to be some difficult interactions with current development plan policies, which have been drafted with the old use classes order in mind and have to be applied in this new world. It doesn't change the development plan, the use classes order, but it will clearly be a most material consideration when, if a proposal is ostensibly contrary to the development plan, it's highly likely that inspectors are going to be supporting changes that are in line with the use classes order. Third, perhaps technical point to make is that it clearly obviously doesn't apply to mixed uses, and quite a lot of change will concern mixed uses, and indeed some uses have become sui generis uses and aren't covered by it anyway. So with those technical points out of the way, to my mind, the biggest concern is perhaps not the out-of-centre change to retail, but it's what might happen on the high street itself. And in terms of regeneration, it reflects, I think, a thrust that town centres, if they're going to be vibrant, are not going to be just retail. And although some years ago now I acted for a well-known coffee chain for a while, trying to get its outlets into the high street, and it met considerable resistance. But there are now blue banded coffee shops in a number of locations, and other coffee shops are available too. And they're seen, whether you go to Blue Water or other places, seen as almost anchor attractions to retail locations. And that's just that's perhaps a growing awareness that in order to attract people into the city centre, town centre, in the days of lowering demand for retail because of online activity, it needs to become more of an experience. So it is a danger. There is a potential danger, but there's also scope, if pushed and encouraged in the right direction, for it to be a successful change, in my view.
Yeah, Claire, do you want to come in on this one? He says, taking you by surprise. You're on mute, so we can't see you laughing and swearing under your breath.
Oh, I wasn't swearing under my breath. And I mean, I don't think I have anything particular to add, but I was just particularly interested in the last comment that James made about the potential, if it cajoles in the right direction, and particularly how it is that local planning authorities and other bodies charged with regeneration can cajole in circumstances where we're dealing with essentially a deregulatory regime, and what sort of tools that particularly James might think that they have available to them.
Yeah. Actually, while we're on it, Patrick Atherton, who I gather has some experience of Exeter city centre, begins by saying new housing in Exeter city centre has proved popular. That then asks, how, I think directed at Jeremy particularly, but it may be that the other two have something to contribute to. What provision was made or what was done to attract people into the town centre in respect to pedestrian, cycle and good affordable public transport provision? Was that done, and how successful has that been? Jeremy, that's probably to you to begin with.
Okay, thank you. I think in some respects, Chelmsford's geography helps. We're at the confluence of two rivers, and so we have these kind of really nice green river valleys that come right into the city centre, which are perfect for cycleways. So I think it's a bit of I think there's a little bit of luck involved there in relation to how we've been able to bring those and invest in those pedestrian and cycle routes right into the city centre. We have been working, we're a two-tier authority, so we're not actually the highways authority. So we've had to work really closely with our partners at Essex County Council, who are, and we have worked with them to secure LEP funding, growth package funding, a whole series of different funding measures to actually introduce some of the interventions that are required. So at the moment, as we speak, we've got new cycleways, new segregated cycleways going in on some of our sort of arteries coming into the city centre, and that will continue. The other thing that as part of the package is park and ride. Now, park and ride at the moment is not really a particularly viable business proposition as we speak. But as part of the strategy, it's always been a sort of a three-zone approach. The centre being walking, the outer area being cycling and buses. That's our main form of public transport within the urban area. But then our outer is actually intercepting traffic coming into the city centre by two park and rides that are open and a third one planned within our new local plan. And they have been funded bus lanes coming right into the city centre, bus prioritisation, connecting the new university with the bus, with the new park and ride. And I think that has been the ability to actually sort of really penetrate into the city centre for public transport. I think the point you were talking about in terms of good, affordable, reliable public transport is an issue for all areas really. Obviously, it's a private operators, and ensuring there's demand is really important to ensure that they can continue that affordable, reliable public transport. So as part of each one of our greenfield sites, we are really pushing for public transport interventions, but that's actually making sure the developments actually provide the infrastructure that allows that choice and allows it to be attractive for future bus operators.
Again, amazing segue, because the next question, which is one submitted in advance, is about infrastructure and about the role that infrastructure can play in regeneration. So what roadblocks are there? I mean, no pun intended, given that we're talking to some extent about highways infrastructure. Are there in the system to using infrastructure as a tool for regeneration? Claire, do you want to deal with that one?
Yes, well, I mean, obviously, I think we all appreciate that infrastructure has a very important role to play in regeneration. There's plenty of good evidence about the link between good infrastructure and good economic performance of areas. I think Jeremy just hinted at some of the issues in his last answer. Obviously, one of the big issues we suffer from in this country is that we've got various overlapping bodies who are responsible for funding, who are responsible for different parts of infrastructure, who lack coherent geographical areas. So your LEP partnership may have little geographical relationship to the local planning authorities who are actually trying to put this regeneration in place. Obviously, that leads on to one of the bugbears we all have about the issues around strategic planning, because in the absence of strategic planning, you're essentially having each local planning authority trying to deal with these issues on their own. And I think we probably generally think that the duty to cooperate isn't really being very effective in resolving some of these bigger issues. And I think particularly in terms of the local plans that are coming through at the moment, the emphasis is very much on the local planning authority putting in a plan for about the next 15 years, meeting their housing needs, putting in the infrastructure to ensure they meet their housing needs. But is that really allowing the big regeneration projects, which may sort of take longer than that plan period? Often local planning authorities are very, very understandably focused on just meeting the net cycle of housing needs rather than the bigger and more difficult projects. So I think those are just some of the issues that we've got in terms of getting the right infrastructure in place at the right time. Of
course, the other thing that's an elephant in the room is the planning white paper. Now, to some extent, I know some of the responses to the planning white paper have very much emphasised the need for a return to strategic level planning of one sort or another. I can see everybody nodding in what appears to be approval with that, or at least acknowledgement that that's the case. But it's worth talking about the white paper proposals. What do the panel think that, in particular, the renewal zones, which are the sort of middle tier of the proposed zones, might have if, in fact, this zonal approach is adopted? Will that make it easier or simpler or quicker to deliver regeneration schemes, or no difference? Who wants to have a go at that? It's probably your turn, James, if you fancy.
Well, I ducked a difficult question from Clare earlier on, which I'll just pick up. It was really just to say how do you encourage or strong arm people into not abusing the change the use classes order. I think you do that more by encouragement rather than by any other route, but making it clear the opportunities that are available and seeking to build on the use classes order. And that, to some extent, is the same answer as I'm going to give to the question you've just asked, which is that if these growth areas are, if the system is so changed that these growth areas are brought in place, then they should act to encourage regeneration, should make it quicker and swifter, and the changes to planning contributions should also assist in that. The short term, as with any fundamental planning change, is that there'll be a delay, no doubt, caused by people, developers and planning authorities getting used to how this new system's going to work, and for that to bed down. And it always seems to me that changes to the planning system are sometimes self-defeating if they're too frequent and too often and too bold, because people can work with a system they understand. People find it more difficult to work quickly with a system that is fresh and new, and that the various players and contributors in it don't fully understand. So a cautious welcome.
Channeling Lord Carnworth, who wrote, for my money, the comfortably the best and certainly the pithiest of all the well-publicised responses to the white paper consultation. I think it was a page and a half, not a single word spare, but in effect making the point that you've made, James, which is that if you reform planning every 5 or 10 years, then you end up in a difficult place. Claire, anything you want to add about that?
Well, I don't have anything specific to add to that, but Joe, there's a question from Jay Millwood, which I indicated I would happily take, which sort of follows on from the discussion I was having before about could more joint boards echoing LEP boundaries achieve infrastructure quicker? And it seems to me that's exactly the sort of idea that we need to be looking at, some form of higher than local authority governance that matches the funding streams, so that we have some sort of joined up thinking between the funding streams who are getting the infrastructure in place and those actually planning the infrastructure, rather than the more hodgepodge system that we've got at the moment.
Jeremy, what are, just going back to the white paper and the topic of reform generally, what's Chelmsford's response? I mean, you're in that slightly difficult position of just having adopted your plan for the next, 15 years, and then along comes a white paper saying we're doing away with plans of that nature and going to zone everything and do it differently. How did Chelmsford respond to that sort of change? Are you with Lord Carnwath that we should do this less?
Yes, probably. Although I think it really just depends on, so the headline was zoning. I'm not absolutely sure what the government actually in the white paper means by that, and I'm not sure they know what they mean by that either, because the kind of the approach that probably has happened in other countries has been a really simplified approach where you kind of zone for different uses, and I don't necessarily agree with that, but I can see how that simplifies the process. However, I mean, it's like all of these things, the devil's always in the detail. And I know a lot of these areas will have literally 1,000 pages of regulations behind each one of those zoning areas. So I know New York's, I think it's over 2,000 pages. So it just, I suppose it will come down to the detail. And I think actually the way it was finally drafted, it's more about an evolution from where we are now, because I did an exercise. I had a look at all the notations on our local plan, the one that we've just adopted, and I can pop them into each one of those three groups. They're not mutually exclusive. I can pop those in. I think how it's whether there's like the kind of nuance of overlaying zones, because you're always going to have in a renewal area. So your question originally was about renewal areas. Well, quite a lot of them will have other constraints. There will, conservation areas. There'll be other statutory designations within them. So it needs to be a little bit more nuanced and layered. And I think that's inevitable. How that's going to come forward. So that in terms of zoning, in terms of infrastructure delivery, I think it needs to talk a lot more about infrastructure planning and how infrastructure delivery plans are used, not just to get local plans through an examination, how they're actually used to be a living document that are as important as the local plan themselves, to ensure that you do have a much more aligned strategic approach to the delivery of infrastructure, to maximise your opportunities for funding, because that's the other thing. It's actually getting some of this stuff funded, and it can't always be the developer funding all of it. It does require funding streams from other sources. So I think in answer to your question in general terms, I think we were probably less aghast at the white paper after we'd actually read it properly a couple of times. But there are, in terms of the infrastructure funding element of it, that kind of second pillar, then I do think that there are some efficiencies there that we've got some concerns about, not least the risk being placed onto the local authority for the delivery of infrastructure.
Thanks, Jeremy. Amina Rafiq is back with another question. Where I sit in Peckham in London, I'm not very far from the Haygate estate, or what was the Haygate estate. Amina says, what would the panel suggest to improve the outcomes for residents living in areas of deprivation that are undergoing regeneration? My concern, she says, is that the need for affordable housing may result in an increase in deprivation. Of course, the controversy at the Haygate was that the headline was "This is regenerated," but in fact, what that meant was a lot of people in relative poverty being decanted somewhere else, and there was quite a lot of controversy about that. Who wants to have a go at answering that? Does regeneration always mean an improvement for everybody? Don't all jump at once, but one of you's got to volunteer. I'm just going to pick one of you if you don't.
I can start on that, Joe.
Well done, Jeremy.
Because I do think that regeneration, it can't be done to a community. And I think that's where a lot of problems probably arise. It has to be part of a sort of a community consensus about actually what wants to be achieved there. And I think sometimes that kind of whole potential gentrification agenda around regeneration can cause some of the issues that are Amina and yourself have raised. However, obviously, affordable housing there's an acute shortage of affordable housing, and we need to make sure we get the right balance between the types of affordable housing the tenures and the types and sizes of affordable housing to ensure that we do have a mixture of communities living in a particular area. But I do think, yeah, it's definitely a live issue.
Claire.
I think that leads on to one of the issues that I think we really do have to grapple with in order to deal with regeneration, and that's permitted development, and particularly changes to resi, which are obviously coming forwards, and we're all seeing, I think, very unfortunate developments, and obviously a lack of provision of affordable housing and a lack of contribution towards infrastructure. And it seems to me, if we're serious about regeneration, we are going to have to grapple with or change the current system of permitted development rights, because it just isn't working in terms of all of the measurable objectives for regeneration.
It's rare to find anybody in this industry who has a good word to say about the office to resi use class. Is there much of that in Chelmsford, Jeremy?
There is. However, I mean, we've been relatively lucky in the sense that the ones that have switched over have been not so great offices on the edge of the city centre, and therefore in actual terms they've been empty a while. So it's more of a genuine kind of the reason behind the PD in the first place. We haven't really seen it elsewhere, but I do think it's more, as Claire was saying, it's what you get at the end of it. And I mean, there are instances I know of particularly poor standards of development, chiming in what we were talking about right at the beginning about COVID, health and well-being, being able to actually have somewhere where you can sort of hunker down for a while, as we all have to do. To have that in such a poor substandard accommodation just feels wrong on all levels, doesn't it?
It tends to jar a bit with the town centre mixed use approach, the juxtaposition of entertainment uses and residential, because well built town centre residential accommodation with proper sound insulation and so on works well in that context. But my experience as a licensing lawyer as well as a planning lawyer, James, I don't know if you've come across this too, is that where there is a poorly done office to resi conversion with no real thought to sound generation, what that can do is actually put at risk some of the entertainment uses about who previously not given rise to any kind of noise or disturbance issue, but you plonk an office to resi conversion not done very well next to it or them, and you've got a problem, and the licensing regime has to kind of try and deal with that. Catherine Evans asks, and so far I don't have any volunteers to deal with this, so again I'm just going to pick one of you, but I think, Jeremy, I'm afraid it's at you again. I'm very glad you're here. Did the council use compulsory purchase powers to achieve regeneration in Chelmsford, and do the panel think that compulsory purchase powers are fit for purpose?
So in the first instance, no, we didn't. We have done in the past, but the last local plan, we haven't actually undertaken any CPO powers. I do think it is an important part to play in terms of site assembly, and one of our retail centres before the one that I was talking about earlier was done through that means. I think it's part of the tools that are available to a local authority to make sure things come forward in a planned way. But that's probably all I have to say in terms of the Chelmsford perspective and experience.
Anyone else want to add to that? Are compulsory purchase powers enough to get you to where you need to be? James, you look as if you're about to say something.
Yeah, no, well, the powers are all there, but the compulsory purchase system is seriously due an overhaul, and I'm sure Lord Conworth, picking up your earlier comment, would agree with that, because he's had to grapple with some particularly knotty compulsory purchase problems. I mean, compulsory purchase is a difficult issue because you are taking someone's land compulsorily, and you want to make sure that that doesn't happen without adequate checks and balances. And that will always be the case, and leaving aside the financial remuneration that there may have to be. The trouble is it takes too long, or can take too long, and be too involved to produce swift results. And the compulsory purchase system is still anchored in legislation that dates from, you know, the mid-1800s, when people were building railways, and it really could do with an overhaul, far more than the planning system, in my view. Even if just to bring it up to date, so that it's in the language that the modern world can understand. And there's a wealth of experience in applying it, but it needs to be put together in a comprehensive system, in my view. So it's only, I think it's probably on balance a threat to regeneration at the moment, because it is so complicated, potentially, if you get people who are objecting to it.
Anything on the horizon in terms of reform? I haven't heard of anything on that. It's perhaps not as sexy as planning reform.
No, I mean, certainly compulsory purchase is one of those areas where it does almost what you would hope the planning system does, and it's been reformed through gradual evolution. So there obviously have been some reforms in the last 5 to 10 years, but no major overhaul, and I'm certainly not aware of any major overhaul on the horizon.
No, I haven't heard of any either, but that's perhaps one we can write to Lord Carnworth about, and he can put in a submission. There is probably the last question given the time. Again, Anthony Masson says this is a bit of a technical question. I think we'll all have a go at this. Use class related question. So at the moment, or at least before the use class changed, Class E came in, an Article 4 direction could remove that office to Resi right, and I know that's been taken up by some councils. I was hearing about a case the other day involving Brent Council. But now that office uses are in Class E, along with pretty much everything else, what's the status of a direction relating to the old Class B1? And will directions made against the old class need to be revisited? Well, I've got a snap view about that, but I'm not really one of the panelists here. So I don't know if any of you, I mean, it seems to me that they will have to be revisited. An Article 4 direction that prohibits or removes a right that is cast in language that no longer applies is very unlikely to be effective. I don't know if any of you want to strongly, violently disagree or violently agree, if you'd like.
Well, I'll agree with you, Joe. I think you're right. I think a Class 4 direction will have been probably specifically directed to the particular class concerned, and perhaps by way of contrast to references in planning policy where there may be an interpretation provision which would allow some form of continuation of the policy with a direction, you would have to revisit and reconsider, and authorities should be thinking of doing that sooner rather than later, in my view.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think
which gives me confidence.
I think the strict answer is they will have to be revisited, but that isn't to say that there won't be a new power to remove the rights that the new Class E gives rise to. A couple more questions which we'll see if we can squeeze in, I think. Jay Millwood, again, we're still waiting for the temporary rights power to come in for CPO that's been on the statute books for a few years now. I think that's probably a contribution to my saying, does anyone know if there's anything on the horizon? It's if you like, an underlining to the answer, no. Looks like it's in the long grass, so thanks for that. And then Patrick Atherton says, and this is an echo, I think, of the points that we've been making about the post-COVID, what people expect from their homes. Why are housing standards so poor? Planning permissions are granted for rooms which are too small for storage and houses which are not thermally efficient. For example, affordable housing usually means poor housing. Jeremy?
I mean, my quick answer to that is to make sure you've got an up-to-date local plan. And I would say that, wouldn't I? So, I mean, if you have the nationally described space standards within your plan, you've got more, local authorities have more ability to ensure that housing standards are increased, and in terms of they relate to storage as well as actually the sizes of the rooms. So I think that's an important part, and also thermally efficient. Also, we've been a bit hamstrung in some regards in terms of some of the sustainable policies, sustainable construction policies that we can bring forwards now through local plans and the kind of interplay between planning policy and building regulations. But again, having a local plan that's up to date, that's supported by up to date evidence, that maximises the opportunities for each council to ensure that it can bring forward some of those measures and some of those standards within their development in their area. And just to finally, I wouldn't always say affordable housing. I mean, in the past, actually, affordable housing's had higher requirements, space standards, and energy requirements than market housing, actually. So I wouldn't necessarily think that affordable housing is the whole partner in that regard.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? We've got about 5 minutes left if you want. If not, I can plug the rest of the Planning Week talks. James.
Joe, I was just going to say that part of the problem with standards is the relationship with building control, and there needs to be better joined up thinking, because it's sometimes difficult to insist on higher standards in planning, whereas quite a lot of people think that that's not really a planning matter, that's your building control. So that's really where the upgrade in thermal standards and as such like will have to come from. It's quite difficult to impose that or insist on that through planning control, in my experience.
So it's another plea essentially for ghastly phrase, but more joined up thinking, not only strategic level planning, infrastructure delivery, but also housing standards. How long will it be before we see a local authority revisiting their housing standards to take in what we've described as the sort of post-COVID new desire for people to have perhaps some work from home units or bigger outside space or whatever? Is anyone heard of any councils thinking about that yet? It's probably too soon, I suspect, but I suspect that's coming down the line. We're more or less at 3 o'clock. Thank you, James and Claire and Jeremy, for your insights and for joining us. And thanks everybody for coming along and joining in, and in particular providing questions for us all to answer and for me to spring on Claire in one example. Sorry about that, Claire. There is one last question which I think is directed to me, which is that picture behind me in 20 years? Well, it's a good question. That's my father, painted in about 1980. So he at that time will have been in his 50s and I'm 41, so you can do the maths. Is it me in 20 years time? I think I'll need to let my hair grow a bit, but it's a good spot. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm just going to show you again the slide of the rest of this week's events, Cornerstone's Planning Week events. You can see that you've either been to or missed part one of the case law update and a very interesting talk yesterday afternoon about net zero from our colleagues Michael and Estelle, but you can get both of those online. The first one is available online now. You can go to our website and find it. The second one is being uploaded, I think, today. There's also, while you're there, an extremely interesting discussion between Estelle and the noted environmental lawyer Richard Buxton, which was published on Monday. And again, that's available to watch on Cornerstone's website. Tomorrow is part 2 of the case law update, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with Robin, Emmeline and Ben. And then a double bill on Friday, as you can see, Plan Making in a Changing Climate from Wayne and Rob, fresh from the letter to them in respect of Tunbridge and Morling's local plan, saying that the local plan has problems. They were defending that, so they can tell you what might have gone wrong, although I don't think they know yet because the inspector hasn't told them. And then on Friday afternoon, remote events. Where are we now? Ashley, who's done, I think did the first virtual planning inquiry post-lockdown, and Ruchi talking about remote events, where we've got to and how we're getting on. All of those events are free. All you have to do is go to the website and register. You'll be sent an extremely informative paper, and then you can either watch the event live, as it were, or shortly afterwards watch it as live, as it were, but course, you won't be able to join in with questions and ask about pictures on people's walls behind them. So again, thanks everybody very much for coming. It is 3 o'clock, and I'm going to end the session now. Thanks very much.